Hello. The focus of this video is campaigns, elections, and voting. So please make sure you read Chapter 8 before attempting any assignments this week. But I want to talk a little bit about the topics of campaigns, elections, and voting, and really focus primarily on the right to vote. So you'll read in the chapter about how the right to vote has expanded. There are a couple terms that we use when we're referring to the right to vote. One is the word franchise, and the other is suffrage. You'll hear people refer to universal suffrage, and that's the idea that all adults in a country have the right to vote. And that is generally the case in the United States. That is, if you're at least 18 years old, not in prison, and a U.S. citizen, you are eligible to vote. But there certainly are, again, non-citizens cannot vote. People who are under the age of 18 cannot vote. And in most states, people who are sentenced to prison are not allowed to vote while they're in prison. Now, a person can vote if they're in jail awaiting trial, but once they've been convicted of a crime, in most states, they do lose the right to vote. And there have been a lot of discussions about whether that's fair. Obviously, when you've been convicted of a crime, the idea is that you've done something against society, and that there's a feeling that people shouldn't have the right to vote. On the other hand, there certainly are disproportionate effects on African Americans and other groups in terms of sentencing for crimes, and so that means that a disproportionate number of people in prisons are people who are black or other races or sometimes other religions. So it is a concern, but right now most states do deny voting rights to people in prison, although you can generally reclaim them when you get out. But certainly we know in this country that we've had a long history of discrimination in voting in terms of the right to vote. If you go back to the very beginning of our country, the only people who were eligible to vote in this country were white male property owners, which was only about 5% of the U.S. population at the time the Constitution went into effect. So the vast majority of people who were here could not vote. The right to vote did expand gradually over the course of American history. So states began dropping the property owning requirement in the middle of the 19th century, middle of the 1800s. At the end of the Civil War, or soon after the Civil War, Congress and the states adopted the 15th Amendment, which is one of the post-Civil War amendments, which guaranteed the right to vote to all people regardless of race. It effectively gave black men the right to vote. At that time, women could not vote, black or white. But it did give black men the right to vote, at least for a period of time. Unfortunately, a number of states after Reconstruction ended, they adopted the Jim Crow policies to disenfranchise and discriminate against black people. And in terms of voting, those discriminatory laws included literacy tests and poll taxes and complicated registration forms. And just to be clear, the literacy tests had nothing to do with whether someone was able to read or write. It was simply a way to deny voting rights to somebody based on their race. And so a lot of times the people who were giving these tests, these were white polling officials, could not read or write, and yet they were giving a literacy test to a black person. And then when the black person didn't pass the test, to the satisfaction of the white polling official, they were denied the right to vote. An example of a question that was asked in one of these tests was, how many bubbles are there in a bar of soap? That is obviously a nonsense question. It has nothing to do with voting. It has nothing to do with American history. There's no right answer to a question like that. It was simply a way to deny voting rights. Since no one could ever come up with a right answer to that, the polling official could say, well, I'm sorry, you're not eligible to vote. And just understand that white people, white men, of course, because women were not yet voting, but white men, and eventually women did gain the right to vote through the 19th Amendment, but again, that only benefited white women. But when white people came in to vote, they were not given the same tests. A lot of times they were able to avoid them because of grandfather clauses, which said if their grandfather had been eligible to vote, they didn't have to, they were automatically eligible to vote. Well, of course, during the Jim Crow period, if you were black, your grandfather had not been eligible to vote, whereas if you were white, your grandfather had been eligible. So And the poll taxes, again, a fee that had to be paid in order to vote. So eventually those things began to change. As I mentioned, the right to vote for women came about through the 19th Amendment in 1920. And then it was really the civil rights era of the 1960s that saw the biggest changes in voting rights. And that's because of protests and lawsuits and other things that a lot of people fought hard for. And certainly people even died for the right to vote. You had people who were killed in the Selma to Montgomery March in 1965. The late Representative John Lewis, who died in 2020, was very badly beaten in a protest. He had been one of the speakers at the March on Washington, and then had fought for the right to vote. He was a very young man at the time. He was brutally beaten and almost killed. And he was, again, fighting for the right to vote. So in 1965, in the aftermath of what was called Bloody Sunday, Congress did adopt the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was really the most significant advance in voting rights in the history of the country, because it really said for the first time that Congress and the federal government would guarantee the right to vote for all people, including African Americans. And for a long time, the law was very successful. It gained, black people did gain the right to vote. The law was enforced. However, in recent years, the Supreme Court has significantly weakened that law. In 2013, they struck down part of it. And in the summer of 2021, in the Supreme Court further restricted it by making it easier for states to pass laws that could make it harder for people to vote. So it's very much in the news. The law still does exist. It has not been completely struck down, but it certainly has been severely limited. And we've seen states adopt restrictions on voting rights. We've seen voter ID laws that are very strict. We've seen the passage of the reduction in polling times, and in other ways that some people would say are designed to make it harder for people to vote. Now, the argument that people make in favor of some of the most recent, like say voter ID laws, is that it's a way to protect against fraud, meaning fraud is when somebody would try to impersonate somebody else in order to vote. And of course nobody wants that to happen. But one thing to keep in mind is voter fraud is very, very rare in this country. That when you look at all the chances to vote over a period of time, say in the 2020 presidential election, instances of voter fraud are maybe maybe 20 at the most across the country, probably less than that. And you can document very few cases of successful voter fraud where somebody actually was able to go in and impersonate someone else and vote. And it would never, ever be enough to change the outcome of a presidential race. When you have millions of people voting, if you're talking about just a handful of cases of potential voter fraud, and in even those, but we're talking about whether it was believed to have happened and then actually did happen, it's even less than that. So voter fraud is not really a problem in the United States, and that's even before some of the states have adopted the strict voter ID laws, because again, people it's not something that happens on a regular basis. So it's just something to keep in mind. Just many studies of voting rights and vote elections have shown that it almost never happens. And that's true both in person as well as by mail, because in recent years, certainly in 2020 with COVID, there were a lot more people voting by mail. But again, they were not able to find very few instances of people trying to vote when they were not eligible to vote. Because there are a lot of other safeguards built into the process, and you do have to demonstrate who you are in other ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be a voter ID. It could be through a utility bill or some other way. There are ways that people could verify their identity. One thing to also understand is one problem with the strict voter ID laws is that people do generally have to pay for those IDs, and some people don't need a driver's license or a state ID for any other purpose. And so there's a money element, there's a time element, and there again, there are really no real instances of voter fraud taking place that have ever altered an election, because it just doesn't happen enough. So it's just something to keep in mind. Again, I definitely understand the concerns people have. They worry about putting, say, a ballot in the mailbox, and that certainly is something that people worry about. But again, the mail is very secure. Now, there have been some concerns about whether there was an effort to slow down the mail, and say in 2020 and things like that. But it is very safe to put something in a mailbox and mail it off. But of course, some people prefer to drop it off in person. But some states have been reducing the number of drop boxes where you can drop it in the box, or where you can go in person and drop it off. So that's just some things that have come up in recent years. And certainly there's a very strong partisan divide between Democrats and Republicans. In the Republican states have been more likely to adopt restrictions on when people can vote and that sort of thing. And Democratic states have been more open to making it easier for people to vote by absentee ballot and so forth. There are some states that actually do have run the entire election online, or I'm sorry, by mail. The states of Oregon and I believe Colorado have both done that, and again, very few instances of voter fraud have been detected in those states. And studies also shown that when it's made easier for people to vote, it doesn't have a partisan advantage. Meaning, it doesn't. Some people think that it would benefit Democrats more, but the studies have shown that it doesn't really benefit one party more than the other. It just means that it's just easier for people to go and vote. The other thing I wanted to mention with the right to vote is the issue of voter turnout. That is, what percentage of people actually vote when an election takes place. The highest turnout you usually get for an election is the presidential election, which takes place every 4 years. But one thing to keep in mind is we have elections every year. We have local elections in the odd-numbered years. We have elections for Congress every 2 years, the House of Representatives every 2 years, senators are up every 6 years. So there's elections taking place every year. Turnout tends to be lower for state and local elections, even though those elections have the biggest impact on our lives. Again, turnout tends to be lower. People are much more focused on the presidential race. We had extremely high turnout for the United States in the 2020 election. It was around 65 to 67%. In previous elections, it had been closer to 55 to 60%. But of course, again, it was much easier for people in most states to vote because of COVID, and because of the mail-in situation. And also there was the fact that people were very much interested in the 2020 election. But I would argue that it's important to vote in every election, because local and state officials do have a very direct impact on our lives. But unfortunately, a lot of people don't vote in those elections. Now, you'll note in the book they talk about how other countries have much higher turnout. Belgium, for example, has 90% turnout. Almost everybody who's eligible to vote in Belgium votes. Australia has 95% turnout. So again, we are in the low range. Now 65% in 2020 was pretty good. 67, I think may have been the final number. So about 2/3 of voters voted, but that means about 1/3 did not vote. And certainly in an election like 2021, when it's just local races, you're not going to see, it's not likely you're going to see 67% turnout in November of 2021. So the question is, why do people not vote in this country? And there are a lot of reasons for that. Certainly the timing of the election is an issue, although the fact that it's on a Tuesday in November generally, although we have elections in other parts of the year for other things, that could be a factor. Although, again, we showed in 2020 with having mail-in voting and people being able to drop off their ballot before Election Day in every state, it certainly drove up the turnout. A lot more people were able to vote. So that's something to consider. There's also the fact that a lot of people just don't like politics, and maybe people who are in this class don't like politics that much. And it's definitely understandable when you have scandals and you have, people say politicians lie or whatever. There's a lot of cynicism about the political process, and so that's an issue as well, and that turns people off to voting. So a lot of things to consider, but I would always strongly argue that people should vote regardless of your party or your identification, because somebody is going to vote. If you don't vote, then somebody will be voting, and they're going to have an influence over who gets into office, and you will not have that influence. And again, political decisions impact our lives in many ways, whether it's the tuition you pay at Henry Ford College, because we are a taxpayer-supported institution, or the road you drive on, or the issues dealing with COVID and so forth, and stimulus payments and things like that. People in Lansing and Detroit and Dearborn make decisions. So if you don't vote, that's certainly your choice and your right. But just understand that somebody is going to be voting, and they're going to have. If you don't vote, that gives them more influence. So I would always strongly encourage people to vote. People, one last thing, people a lot of times say, well, the Electoral College chooses the president. Well, that's true in a way, but understand two things. One is the Electoral College is only for the president. Every other office we vote on is a direct vote, so it's a popular vote. So whoever gets the most votes wins. And even the presidential race, in most elections, the winner of the popular vote does win the electoral vote. That's certainly what happened in 2020 when Joe Biden won the election. We've had some elections where that did not happen. The first time Trump won, or when he won in 2016, he did not win the popular vote over Hillary Clinton, but he did win the Electoral College. But those don't happen on a regular basis. But the other thing is when you vote in person or by mail in a presidential election, your vote is helping to determine who's going to get the state of Michigan's electoral votes, or if you lived in another state, you'll be determining who's going to get that state's electoral vote. So your vote does count at the state level in terms of determining who gets to win the state's electoral votes. And your vote definitely matters directly when you're voting for every other office or issues that are on the ballot. So I'm always a strong proponent of voting. I know there are a lot of good reasons why people don't like to vote, but I would always strongly encourage people to consider voting. It's easy to do. Now, you may not be eligible to vote yet or in the area where you live, but if you are eligible, I definitely encourage you to vote. And it's very easy. In Michigan, we now have automatic registration, so when you renew your driver's license or state ID card, you're automatically registered to vote unless you choose not to. And your voter registration goes into effect almost right away. So it used to be a 30-day wait. Now it goes into effect. You can actually register on election day and vote that day. So anyway, I know there's a lot of information in this video. If you have any questions, please let me know. And have a great week.